أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, brothers and sisters, and a warm welcome to all of our guests. Thank you for joining us at the great debate. It's a privilege to have you once again back at this venue, and it's a privilege to have another event. We have an amazing lineup today. My name is Ahmad Uddin. I'm usually the organizer of the great debate. I'm going to hand you over to the chairman, Bashrat Ali, who's going to chair proceedings for tonight, inshallah.
Very few events in history, in modern history, evoke the emotions that the Balfour Declaration does. And as with everything, there are two sides. Some people passionately support that declaration, whilst others are vehement in their rejection of it, to put it politely. This evening we have a panel of three eminently qualified people to speak upon the consequences just over 1 century on from the declaration that was made by Arthur Balfour in 1917. I'll start from my left. Al-Karami was born in Jerusalem and was one of the many hundreds of thousands of Palestinians who were forced to leave their homeland after the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. She moved to the United Kingdom, where she grew up and, of course, has settled. She's somebody who has practiced as a doctor, as a medical doctor in the past, and has now moved on and is involved in Middle Eastern politics, has been involved in the School of Oriental African Studies and at the University of Durham and Leeds. And lately, she is now a research fellow at the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies at the University of Exeter. It's a slightly summarized CV. Much could be said, but I'll keep it succinct. Equally so, Neil Faulkner, who sits to my immediate left, is the editor of the Military History Monthly. He's the founder and director of Sedgeford Historical and Archaeological Research Project and co-director of the Great Arab Revolt Project. He has authored many books. Of particular relevance is Lawrence of Arabia's War, the Arabs, the British, and the remaking of the Middle East in World War I. He has one coming up, which may possibly be relevant, The First Modern Jihad, 1870 to 1920, which is due to be released next year. To my right, I have Dr. Abdulwahid Shader. He's a general practitioner by profession. He's also a member of the Executive Committee of Hizb ut-Tahrir Britain, the Islamic Liberation Party, and he has written extensively. He's been published in the Times Educational Supplement, the Eurasia Review, Foreign Policy and Open Democracy, but to name a few. He's also written for 5 Pillars. He has debated many people in many places, David Goodhart, Edwina Kerriot, etc., and has appeared in many of the well-known international and domestic media organizations. Now, the format of the debate is, just bring up my page, that we will start with each of the speakers giving you 10 minutes or so in terms of their viewpoint. So after that, there will be a little bit of a panel discussion, and then of course we open it up to the floor. What matters most are the views from the floor, which of course as a chair I will invite the speakers to address the questions, and as a chairman I'll exercise my prerogative and raise any issues which I think are pertinent to the discussion. I apologise for my croaky and hoarse voice, but it's that time of the year and I'm a little bit under the weather, to put it mildly. So, if we can start first with Al-Karami to come to the podium and give us, or share her thoughts with us. Please welcome to the podium, Al-Karami, please.
Thank you very much, and good evening. Our subject tonight is the legacy of the consequences of the Balfour Declaration. Well, first of all, there were, if you like, there were an immediate consequence short-term consequence, an immediate consequence, and long-term, with which we are living now. Now, the immediate consequence of the Balfour Declaration was, of course, the dispossession of the Palestinian people like me. That was a direct consequence of the Balfour Declaration, which, just to remind ourselves, was a promise of support by the British government just after the First World War to assist a foreign group of Jews who were Zionists, called Zionists, to facilitate their project to set up a state for Jews in Palestine. That's, in effect, what the Balfour Declaration was. But it was worse than that, because having given this promise of support, the British administration in Palestine then went on to help the incomers, these foreign Jews, to get a foothold in the country, to start to develop institutions, actually institutions of state, and encourage them and defended them and protected them right until 1948, when the whole project, the British presence in Palestine was untenable because of the objection of the Palestinian Arabs to what was being done to their country. So that, in effect, was the Balfour project, if you like, the Balfour Declaration. But I think, you see, one of the worst things about this, this action by the British was that they didn't just support the entry of an alien community of people into a country not their own in order to establish themselves. So that was bad enough. But what was much worse is the nature of this project, the nature of the people who set it up. And what I mean by that is that the British, I think, probably unwittingly, let in to the heart of the Middle East a group of people with a very, very dangerous set of ideas. I'm very glad to see some ladies here. Otherwise, we would have a real gender imbalance. So the British let in a group of people with an ideology which was extremely dangerous and has damaged the region and has continued to damage it. And what I mean by that is these were a set of people with an ideology of entitlement. Entitlement. They didn't come into Palestine grateful to the British, saying, well, thank goodness, you know, our project is going to work. Thank you, Britain. They didn't. They came in with the idea that it was theirs by right, and that Britain's role was to help them implement their right. That's one side of that ideology. And the second side of that, of course, was that it was supremacist. It believed that the project was superior to any other idea. And therefore, so you had, if you can imagine, the entry of people armed with ideas of entitlement and ideas that their ideology, well, the things they believed in, were superior to those people who are around them. And that, I think, I'm speaking as a Palestinian, I will never forgive the British for. Not only was it bad enough to let in these aliens into my homeland, but these particular aliens, and this is nothing to do with being Jews, this is to do with being Zionists, with this kind of idea. Okay, so in the short time, I have very short time, the consequence of allowing a group of people with this kind of idea in their heads into a country already inhabited by an innocent, poorly educated, unprepared set of people like the Palestinians. Got to realize that at the time, we're talking about 1920 onwards, the Palestinians were an agrarian people. They were largely uneducated and illiterate. That's the truth. So my grandfather and the people around him were people, not my grandfather himself, but they were people who tended not to read or write and to not have much knowledge about the outside world. So these people were thrown like a lamb to the sacrifice in the face of a sophisticated, quite developed invasion from Europe, which is what the Zionist project was. And inevitably, you don't have to be a genius to predict what would happen if you were to do that. The Zionists set up a state. It was supported by the Western powers, and it established itself, and it expanded beyond the borders that the British had allowed it to have. And the result of that was 5 Arab-Israeli wars after 1948, the creation of the refugee problem, which I've just talked about, which has been with us for 70 years, because in May of this year, it will be 70 years since the State of Israel was established and Balfour's Declaration came into full effect. So, wars, refugees, and we're left with an unresolved Palestine problem, where once upon a time it was a Jewish problem, which was trying to find a solution for itself. We now have a Palestine problem, which we never used to have until the State of Israel was created. So there is now an unresolved Palestine problem, which is a central reason why the region is unstable and why the world powers, particularly the West, is still involved in the Middle East after all this time. Israel has acted as a destabilizing factor in the region, and its increasing power, its increasing reach, it has a huge arsenal of arms, it has a huge army, and it is a nuclear state. That's very frightening in the middle of a region which, as you see from recent times, is undergoing a series of changes and instability which we haven't seen for many decades. Israel, therefore, remains today a source of instability and a source of danger, quite apart from the injustice of having set it up in the first place. Now, I've taken over my time, Mr. Chair, I'm sorry, and I would want, had I had time, to go into the question of what is to be done about all this. Because after all, you know, we can go on and on saying, and Palestinians do and their friends do, how terrible this was, how unjust, how dreadful, how ghastly, how awful Israel is. But the fact is we're lumbered, we've got Israel. So the question really now is, what are we going to do about it? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. In answer to your question, we will be addressing that as one of the issues which I'll be raising if nobody else does from the floor. So, thank you very much. Now we'll ask Neil Faulkner to come to the podium, please, and share his thoughts upon the legacy of the Balfour Declaration 100 years on. Please welcome Neil Faulkner.
Thank you very much. And indeed, thank you, brothers and sisters, for being here and providing us with this audience. I know that Ahmad was hoping for a debate. I don't know that there's going to be a great deal of debate, because, of course, I don't have any disagreements whatsoever with anything that Ghada has just said. And in relation to, Ali's introductory remarks about there being two sides in political conflict, of course, there are always two sides in political conflict, but there is only one truth. And it is the job of serious academics and serious activists to establish what that truth is. And I think that's what this meeting is really about, to clarify the truth of what happened 100 years ago and the impact that that has had. So I want to make these few points. The first thing I want to say is this. What the Balfour Declaration did, and I think Gada is right, that the British did not, they didn't foresee the full implications of it, but they had an instinct for what was going to be useful for them. And it goes back actually to the middle of the 19th century. In the middle of the 19th century, Palmerston, who was Prime Minister in the middle of the 19th century, saw the potential in having a Jewish settlement in Palestine, the way in which that could help to stabilise the region in relation to British interests. And when the whole discussion was going on around Balfour, one of the things that Weizmann, who of course then was the leading Zionist activist in Europe, based in Britain, one of the things that Weizmann said when he was lobbying for British support for the Zionist project was, Palestine will fall within the influence of England. This is how he imagined the outcome of the First World War. We could easily move 1 million Jews into Palestine within the next 50 to 60 years, and England would have a very effective and strong barrier, and we would have a country. So right from the very beginning, there's the sense that there's a deal to be done between imperialism and the Zionist project. And I think the British sensed that. They'd sensed it from the middle of the 19th century. And they weren't terribly bothered about the implications of that in relation to the people who lived in the area already. The cynicism was, if you look at some of the things that they were saying privately, the cynicism was pretty breathtaking. I mean, the Balfour Declaration makes reference, of course, hypocritical reference to the interest of the people who already lived in the area. And of course, there was no free land to be settled. Everybody in, the whole of Palestine was occupied by Palestinian farmers. And the British establishment didn't care about the implications of the Balfour Declaration. This is Balfour himself, shortly after the war, and he says, "We do not propose even to go through the form of consulting the wishes of the present inhabitants of the country. The four great powers are committed to Zionism, and Zionism, be it right or wrong, good or bad, is rooted in age-long tradition, in present needs, in future hopes, of far profounder import than the prejudices of 700,000 Arabs who happen to live there at the moment." That's the depth of the cynicism which was in play in relation to the British establishment. And why do they want this Jewish settlement that turns into the Jewish state? Which is, let's define it. It is a colonial settler state utterly dependent on imperialism. It was dependent for its creation on the role of British imperialism, which Gada has been talking about, and it's utterly dependent for its survival today on US imperialism. Without the flow of funds and without the flow of arms from the United States, it would not be able to sustain itself. It's a colonial settler state backed by imperialism. That is, if you like, a scientific definition of what this thing is, what this entity is. Whatever arguments there might be on the other side, that's the reality. Why does it work so powerfully for them? Because the Zionists have nowhere else to go. And I want to explain what I mean by that by referring to the Balfour Declaration's twin, its twin sister, which is the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Because at the same time as they're producing the Balfour Declaration, they have this secret agreement with their allies in the First World War that they're going to divide up the Middle East between themselves after the war. And in the short term, that means that there is, after the First World War, there's direct colonial rule in some places, like Syria, for example. There's colonial rule or neo-colonial rule through puppets, and that's the situation effectively in Iraq, where the British put Faisal in as the king. So they create a kind of settlement of the Middle East after the First World War, which chops it up into a series of what are initially separate states or provinces controlled by the outside imperial powers, but that creates the basis for the modern Middle East, that as these separate states which have been created by this imperial settlement, as they achieve their independence, they retain that fragmentation. And that fragmentation is central to the ability of imperialism to maintain control over the region. You want a fragmented Middle East. You don't want a united Middle East. You want Sunni against Shia. You want Iran against Saudi. You want a series of conflicts inside the region that makes it easier for imperialism to maintain effective control over the economic sources of the region, crucially, of course, oil supplies. You know, you can't have a discussion about any of what is happening in the Middle East without keeping in mind all the time the Middle East has 70% of the world's oil supplies, and that's the single most important commodity in the modern world capitalist economy. That ultimately is what all this is about. Now, the problem for the imperial powers, and it starts with Balfour and it starts with Sykes-Picot and it comes right through to the present. The problem for them is this. In relation to the fragmentation of the Middle East, the wider fragmentation, the legacy of Sykes-Picot, the other bit of the equation, the problem with that is that the fragmentation is never certain. And that is because the people of the region have a common interest in uniting against the imperial domination of the region and uniting against the Zionist presence. So the possibility arises always of an upsurge of some kind of pan-Arab movement that can begin to overcome the fragmentation and bring the Arabs together as a whole and threaten the settlement which is imposed upon the region at the end of the First World War. Challenge the fragmentation, which is the basis of effective imperial control over the region. That possibility exists. It existed in the 1950s to a degree, at the time of Nasser, when Egypt and Syria, the two key countries of the Middle East, were at the time anyway, were moving towards some kind of unification. It arose very recently with the Arab Spring, and the possibility that there was going to be a revolution from below to democratize the region, to achieve major social reforms, to challenge head-on the domination of the region by neoliberal capitalism, by foreign corporations, and so on. And I tell you, in the Pentagon, in London too, all of the lights were shining red with alarm, as the Arab people began to move into action in 2011 and 2012 with the possibility of a pan-Arab revolution sweeping across the region. That was a moment of extreme danger for them. What's crucial about Israel is this. The Arab people of the region could come together in a mass movement from below to challenge the dominance of the Western powers, the dominance of the imperial powers. The crucial thing about the Zionists is they have nowhere else to go. They are an alien presence in the region. They are a colonial settler state. That means they have to be necessarily, under all circumstances, absolutely loyal to those who supply them with the arms and the funds in a situation of crisis in the region. I completely agree with what Gada has said about them losing control. Sometimes, if you like, I mean, they create a Frankenstein's monster in a sense. That Zionism is sometimes out of control. What is absolutely clear is that what they can be certain of is that the Zionists cannot form an alliance with the mass of the people of the region and become part of an anti-imperialist movement that begins to challenge in a serious way the domination of the region by the Western powers. That's why Israel matters to them. That's why Zionism has been so crucial to the way in which the region has operated and the way in which the imperial powers have operated in relation to it for the last 100 years.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Very important. I'll invite invite now Dr. Abdul Shader to give us his thoughts on the legacy of Balfour 100 years on, and then we'll have a discussion and open up the floor. Dr. Abdul Shader.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. Good evening, assalamu alaikum to all of you. Before I start with my take on this question, I'd just like to say two things. First of all, after I arrived, I was told that this event was nearly cancelled because I was invited to speak at it. So thank you to the event organisers for inviting me and keeping me on the programme, and thank you to the venue for sticking firm despite whatever pressures they had put on them by whoever put it on them. And I'll leave it for you to judge whether what I'm going to say is completely beyond the pale. I'm coming from an Islamic perspective, but I think that that is still valid within political discourse on this subject. The second thing I'd have to say is I'd reinforce what Neil said, which is that I don't know how much of a debate we're going to have, because really he's stolen quite a lot of my thunder. You know, Balfour by itself, the Balfour Declaration by itself, you can't look at it on its own. It was one aspect of British foreign policy related to Palestine, and Palestinian policy during World War I was one aspect of overall Middle East policy. And so taken by itself, maybe this pledge that was made has a moral indefensibility, because really it can't be defended by somebody in London offering somebody else's land to a third party. That's morally indefensible. But as an action of foreign policy, it's one of many things that happened, not just at the end of World War I, but actually going beyond that. And what happened in the Middle East is effectively the change of the Middle East order, which allowed this situation today to persist. So you had Britain pledging this land, you had Sykes and Picot dividing the land, and further divisions at the end of World War I in the conferences that were held afterwards. You had the Lausanne Treaty, which really finally decided who got which bits of the Middle East, and the settlement that was put upon Turkey. The period we're talking about is very different to today. The petty debate about Brexit versus Remain was not what was on the table. Britain had an empire. It was one of the great powers in the world, alongside France and Germany and Russia and the Ottoman state. And the jewel in Britain's empire was India. India, the great wealth provider out of which the city of London wouldn't really exist today. And a lot of British policy was about defending that interest, the fear that Germany, or before that France, would actually threaten Britain's position in India. And Middle East control was crucial to that. Taking Egypt from the Ottoman state to secure the route through the Red Sea was crucial to that. Taking the Middle East as a whole and changing the whole order was crucial to that. So you cannot see Balfour on its own as something that led to the disaster that we have today. You have to see it as part of something bigger, which includes the foundation of the League of Nations and then eventually the United Nations, which gave legal precedent to giving somebody else's land to a third party. Okay? It's important to understand that. Why? Because if we look at the oppression of the Palestinians today, if we look at the dispossession of their land, if we look at the bloodshed and life lost in the last 7 decades, actually more than that, because there was life lost under the British mandate at the end of World War I as well. So if you look at all of that that's happened within Palestine, it's the same root causes that have caused that I would argue that have led to the chaos and tragedy in Syria today or in Yemen today. Because, as Neil said, part of the World War I settlement after World War I was to divide the land and put in these proxy rulers who were not ruling on behalf of the people, but were rather ruling on behalf of colonial powers. And these rulers never had any legitimacy, and the lack of legitimacy has always meant that they've had to rule by force, which has always led to a backlash from the people periodically. So it's no accident that that region has seen chaos and misery for 7 decades. Why is it important to understand that for me? Because I hope when we come to look at a way forward and solutions to the problem, we realize that if the chaos that exists there today, the injustice that exists there today, was because of a radical reform in the Middle East, division of the Middle East, a creation of unstable statelets in the Middle East without any central political authority, then actually to achieve something close to a decent settlement for all the people, some harmony and stability for all the people, you have to undo that. You need a similar radical change in the Middle East. And when you look at the proposals put on the table by the great powers, most notably this two-state solution, which I don't see as any kind of solution, or even the one-state model put forward by Britain after World War I, these were solutions put forward by the very people that have created the problem. And therefore, I don't see these solutions having any real antidote to the problem. What we need is something that reunites this balkanized region. What you need is something where there is some stable governance with some legitimacy. This is a region that has a shared heritage, a shared history, largely a shared faith, a shared language that was actually part of one unified entity, which was the Ottoman state at one time, and for a longer period of time. The historian Jonathan Schneer actually says in his history about the Balfour Declaration that previously this land had not known this kind of trauma. The friction, the division, the hostility between Jew and Muslim and Christian was not known. And actually, you know what? I'm not saying that it was a panacea all the time, but from the time of the Caliph Omar entering into that land, liberating it from the Romans, to the time of the Crusader occupation, and thereafter from the time of the liberation of Salahuddin to the entry of Allenby, are almost unique periods in the history of that region where people could live side by side without animosity, people could worship in their holy places. And this was something, when you look at the legacy of Balfour and all of British foreign policy in that region, I personally do think it was an intentional policy to divide and weaken the region, to control it, and that has for the sake of largely India, but that's continued. As Neil said, there's oil in the region, but also in the interim period we had the Cold War, and that's a very strategic land. So the need to control that, there was a competition over the region during the Cold War as well. But the need, Jonathan Schneer says, it was a land that had previously been more or less at peace. And that I do not believe can happen until we reverse some of this, whether it's Zionism or even to some extent some of the Arab nationalism that has existed in the region. When I advocate an Islamic solution, I don't advocate it as the fact that somehow Muslims are better and holier than thou. No, I advocate it because Islam is not like Judaism. Judaism, as several rabbis have told me, is a religion, not a political faith. They want to go to Jerusalem to worship, not to have it as their political capital center, right? So Islam is different. Islam has a view on everything in life. It has a view on politics. It has a view on governance. And part of that means Islam has a view on its citizens, regardless of what faith they are or if they have no faith. Those people are citizens with rights. And when that exists in the region, when that existed in the region, it had harmony. And I really, truly believe the only way you'll get back, because to some extent it's the natural form of governance for those people. What's been a problem in the last century or so is this attempt to force alien systems on those people, which just hasn't worked. It hasn't worked. The Arab Spring was the last manifestation, if you like, of people erupting against that. And now you have this new settlement with the likes of the CCs and the new old order, if you like, re-established there. We need something which actually can guarantee the peace and stability for all the people in the region. And really, I hope we can explore that a bit more in the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Dr. Now, what I would first of all like to do is ask my panelists just to give me a quick comment on what they've heard from each other, literally a summary of what you each take from each other's views, and then we'll come to the floor and I'll pose some questions around. So, start with you again, Nada.
No, you shouldn't. You should go.
All right, start with you.
Okay, thank you. I liked Professor Karami's short-term, long-term breakdown. It reminded me of something that I'd read about Balfour. One of the costs of the Balfour Declaration was on English Jewry. I don't know if you know that, but English Jews at the time didn't want a Zionist state because they wanted to belong within England. They wanted to belong within Britain. And for them, offering a foreign place to go and live was effectively saying to English people of Jewish origin that you don't really belong in Britain. And Balfour had formed, by the way. He was a former prime minister before he was foreign secretary. And he was responsible for the 1905 Alien Act, which was trying to restrict immigration from Eastern Europe, Jews who were fleeing persecution in Eastern Europe, who were trying to come to Britain for a refuge. So I think that was one of the short-term consequences of this, that actually it was a message to Jews within Europe that actually, you know what, you're not really welcome, you're not really citizens here, you've got a home somewhere else, so we'll sort that out for you and then you can go. That's really the signal. Neil, as I say, I think you stole a lot of my thunder.
I'm sorry.
I would just say, I think you're right. In the history of the last 50 to 70 years, there has been this idea of pan-Arab potential in the region. But I'd actually say that Arab nationalism has died now. There is really much more of a pan-Islamic sentiment there. Because you've got to remember, right on the neighbourhood there is Turkey also. And Turkey's changed immeasurably in the last few decades. And really there's a very strong Islamic sentiment within that region as well. So I think that's a big change that's happened.
Thank you very much for that, Neil.
Okay, let me say, I just want to pick up on something that you were saying about the experience of Palestinians essentially being dispossessed, and I think it's worth spelling out, isn't it? Because there is this Zionist argument that, of course, the land was sold, and I think it's just worth just picking that apart. I'm sure lots of people are aware of this argument and how fallacious it is, but it's worth repeating it because the Palestinian peasantry, they were, as you described them, they were relatively simple people with a farming way of life. Most of them were illiterate and so on. And crucially, most of them were tenant farmers who did not own the land on which they worked. And very often they had been working that land for many, many generations. So when the Zionists say they bought the land, very often that is true. Very often it's literally true. They bought it from absentee Arab landlords because they were well funded by Western capitalists, Western millionaires. They had the funds to buy the land. And the Zionists would then move on to the land and turf off the people who had been working it for centuries. So this was a class question, in a sense. And then latterly, they did another thing. They terrorized people into leaving the land. And that's what's happening in 1948. And in 1948, I mean, Deir Yassin is the massacre that is most famous in history. The truth is, you don't need to kill many people for the word to get around that if you stay, you're likely to get killed. And that's why hundreds of thousands of people fled in 1948. It was because they feared that they were actually going to be murdered. And very, very important that that argument is absolutely held.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. I think there were aspects of what both speakers before me said, with which I entirely agree. But I do have a comment. First of all, I'm not. Neil Faulkner talked about the interest of Western imperialists to divide the region, so that the Arabs didn't unite and form any kind of opposition to imperialism. Now, that is quite a well-known argument and a well-known set of ideas. I've always slightly wondered about that, you know, only in this sense, not because it's not true that that's what they would desire, but only because I often feel that things happen not so much as conspiracies and designs in which, you know, some great puppet master sits in Whitehall or Washington or wherever, and all these little puppets are then moved to go to various places, like a chessboard. It's much more the fact that imperial states, or any state that's got any sense, are opportunists. They look at a situation and wonder what they can get out of it, what would benefit them. So in a way, it's a bit a result of that, actually, in which they do whatever they think would help them. Now, so in terms of, I have to talk, Dr. Abdulwahid, the question of the Ottoman Empire, I couldn't agree more. The Ottoman Empire was one of the most interesting experiments in how minorities live together. And as far as I'm aware, it has never been better, never been better. If you think that the Ottoman Empire ruled over multiple communities of people and managed for many centuries not to have the kind of constant unrest, revolutions and the like, with which you might anticipate, was partly to do with the system which they had, in which you had what was called the millet system, which is where minorities had their own separate autonomous status. They practiced their religion, they spoke their language, they had to subscribe to Ottoman law, but otherwise they lived within their communities. Very interesting way of doing things. Look at the situation today. It's not about that at all. Finally, I need to just clarify a few issues. Land ownership. You know that with all the tricks that Neil Faulkner mentioned, the absentee landlords, the Zionists running around trying to persuade them to sell land, with all that, by 1947, the Zionists owned less than 7% of Palestine. So it's a complete lie. When you hear Zionists say to you, oh, well, they bought the land, it's a lie. They bought less than 7%. That's one. And the other issue is the one about expulsion, ethnic cleansing, etc. Of course, the Zionists use different methods. There was the massacre method, quite right. There I have seen other very terrifying examples where the people fled in terror, but they intimidated people in many different ways. And when it came to it, in 1948, when the war really started, they simply drove people out at the point of a gun. It wasn't very subtle at all. So they put them on trucks and they threw them out. In fact, in one town, Suffolk, the young people, the young men were put on trucks and things and thrown out, and the old people were left behind to die, basically, because they were too slow getting on these trucks, you know. So they used a lot of methods to do that.
Thank you very much. I'm going to ask a question to try and put the other perspective to all three of you, and have a short response. The State of Israel would say that it was created by operation of international law, and it has legitimacy based upon what the prevailing body at the time and currently the United Nations with Britain and America endorsed. So they have legitimacy based upon international law.
Well, I personally, I would fundamentally challenge that legitimacy, because that really what you've got at the end of World War I is the victors setting up their own international law in the League of Nations, and at the end of World War II, the victors setting up their own international law in the form of the United Nations, which has a rigged Security Council. But even if you accept it, I mean, how many resolutions have there been which actually denounce the Zionist occupation? And there have been so many which are effectively ignored. So is it an impotent international law? And even if, is it willfully impotent? Because what's the point of legal resolutions where nothing is done? I mean, one of my arguments about the need of an alternative thinking is that for 70 years, it's not as if the UN said nothing on this. It's said a lot, but nothing has been done for these people.
Can I
want all of you to say, because the issue here is one of legitimacy, and the State of Israel says correctly, in terms of international law as it was and is, that they were recognized as a nation by the United Nations.
Yeah, let me just comment on this. In fact, the State of Israel was set up, it declared itself on May the 14th, 1948. The leader, the Zionist leader who became Israel's first Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion, was the one who made this announcement. It was a unilateral announcement saying, I announce today, I declare the State of Israel has been set up. Now, where the United Nations came in was that in 1949, that is 1 year after this unilateral declaration by the Zionists that they set up the State of Israel, Israel was admitted as a member state of the United Nations. That is the basis on which you will hear the question of legitimacy according to the United Nations and international law. However, and I made a special study of this because it really interests me, this question of how legitimate Israel really is. If you look at the terms, and I realize this may be too detailed for our limited time here, but if you look at the terms under which Israel's membership was accepted, you can't just be a collection of people, go to the UN and say, I wish to be a state. I'm sure you understand that. You have to comply with certain things in order to be admitted, and Israel did not fulfill the terms of UN membership. Period. It just did not. And you could argue that on that basis, it should never have been admitted. And the reason it was admitted is very fascinating, because that's all to do with post-Second World War desire on the part of Western states to recompense the Jews, of course at somebody else's expense. So that's actually what happened. And if we have time, I'm very happy to give you more detail.
I'm going to give a very short answer to this, because my view is this, that if you have an international order which is unjust, an international order where exploitation and oppression and violence against minorities and so on is intrinsic to the way in which the system is operating, then any system of international law based upon that is itself bound to be unjust, and in relation to any wider moral framework, illegitimate. So I would question the legitimacy of an international framework of law created by a world dominated by great imperial powers.
Thank you. One more chairman's prerogative, and then I'll come to everybody on the floor. The second justification, lately the Home Secretary, I forget her name, who has been speaking quite... No, not here, sorry, in Israel, I forget her name, which is 31 or 32, who says that it's a biblical justification. So if it's not one based upon the legitimacy based on international law, then we have a history running from the Prophet Moses, peace be upon him, and therefore it's a sense of entitlement, and that's what legitimizes us. What do you say to that, Neil?
Okay, well, you see, it's false reasoning because the people who have actually moved into Palestine in the last century have absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with the people who happened to live there 2,000 years ago. I mean, Judaism was a religion, and it was a proselytizing religion, actually, for a large part of its history. It hasn't been that recently, but it was a proselytizing religion for a large part of its history, and large numbers of people in Eastern Europe, in particular, but in other places too, actually converted to Judaism. And what has actually happened over the last century is that Palestine has filled up with people who are actually British, or Polish, or American, or Russian. And very often you only have to watch one of the broadcasts where one of their ministers is speaking, and they just sound like somebody who's come off the street of New York, or London, or whatever. These are recently arrived immigrants who have been given land on the basis of the dispossession of the people who lived in that area and who held that land, and in many cases held it for centuries. The argument just, on a biblical basis, it just doesn't hold up, because there's no connection between these two different groups of people, the people who were kicked out by the Romans in the 2nd century AD, and the people who are now living there as an alien presence.
Yeah, and actually that's all absolutely correct. But you see, supposing they were descendants, let us imagine they were descendants of these ancient Israelites, the question still remains, how on earth does that entitle any people who say they come from a particular part or they are descendants from, how does it entitle them to take the country today? That's one. And secondly, since when was religion used as a title to property? Since when? I mean, how great it would be if I turned up in Istanbul and said to the people in the Blue Mosque, listen, this is mine because I'm a Muslim. It's ridiculous. So I'm really, thank you for bringing it up, but it's just an old Zionist chestnut. It drives me mad.
You've got to bring the balance to the discussion. There's nobody putting the other case across. Otherwise, if you give us your view on that, then I'll go to the floor.
So until the persecution of Jewish people in Europe in the 1930s, Orthodox Jewry was against Zionism in huge numbers. It's now a minority of Orthodox rabbis and Jews who are anti-Zionist, but until that great persecution in the 1930s, it was the majority. And the Zionist project was never a religious project. It was always a nationalistic project, actually, which is one of the reasons it's become very ugly there now, and it's effectively an apartheid society, because it's got all those evils of nationalism that you see anywhere in the world when nationalism rears its head.
Thank you very much to all of the speakers now. If you can put your hands up if you want to contribute. The golden rule is it's got to be a question or a comment inviting a response. If you want to audition for the next seat on the panel with a speech, do a YouTube video to the organisers. So with that in mind, if you can have some very lucid and succinct questions from the floor or comments which you want an answer to, please feel free to stick your hand up. There's a mic, a roving mic, and I will direct it your way. So we have a gentleman at the front, my right, your left.
Thank you. I think one event that wasn't particularly mentioned was the United Nations motion, I think it was in 1947, what to do with the old Ottoman Empire province of Palestine. And I think that motion did recognise that there were actually two groups of people, Jews and Arabs, each had a claim to that territory. And it's proposed what's called now the two-state solution. I think that that's a great pity that wasn't accepted by both sides. It would have had Jerusalem presumably as the joint capital or capital of each of those states. There would have been two independent states. I believe that's still the framework for any future solution. But at the moment, Israel is in military control of the West Bank. and if I speak to Israelis, I suggest it's now time that they should recognise Palestine as a state, as an independent state based on the West Bank. I can't see this happening, of course, while the present government of Netanyahu is in power, but he may not be there forever. He's obviously opposed to that. So my question, really, to put it into a question as the chairman wants, is do you, I got the impression from at least two of the speakers, two men speakers, that Zionism and Israel has to disappear in some future solution. I frankly don't see this as a viable possibility, whatever criticisms one has of it.
Can I summarise that into a question?
My question is, do you agree that in fact the only solution is for the Arabs to recognise that Israel does now exist and Palestine should exist alongside it on the West Bank?
Just to understand, for the purpose of putting the question, what do you say is the justification? A pragmatic de facto recognition, or is it your principle that you say that underpins the two-state solution?
In principle, I think there are two groups of people, each deserve to have their own state with Jerusalem as the capital.
Joint capital. Okay, thank you. So I want to come to you first with the two-state solution. Both sets of people have a claim.
So, aside from, I guess, the historic issue of taking somebody else's land and giving it to a third party, which delegitimizes any of the idea of a two-state solution for me, I think even if you look at the practicalities today from the Palestinian side, it's the region that is proposed as being given to the Palestinians is a tiny proportion of the land, fragmented, where they are not allowed to have anything resembling what a state should have, right, in terms of its own ability to secure itself, its own ability to be an independent state. And that completely delegitimizes it. And if I go back to one of the things that was mentioned, I mentioned it, I think Neil mentioned it as well, is that one of the reasons that whole region is unstable is that it's been balkanized, it's been carved up, smaller and smaller and smaller, less and less stable. And you know, if you did that anywhere in the world, within Britain, within the United States, you would get chaos. You would not get the kind of stability that all the people of the region actually deserve. It's just not a solution for me. It's a proposal that actually, really, I think it would just legitimize the continuation of the instability, which allows the region to be controlled. That's how I'd have to understand it, really.
You can both give your responses to that, briefly.
Okay, you see, I think the problem, there are two problems. I think one is it doesn't understand that Zionism is a process. It's not a static thing that has reached a certain point and then stops. It's a process. It's a process of dispossession. And because it's a process of dispossession, it provokes resistance. And because there is resistance, Israel is permanently insecure. Because Israel is permanently insecure, it needs to take more land and bring in more people, more settlers. So you've got an ongoing, unfinished process of dispossession, of the creation of settlements, of Israeli expansion into areas which are still being lifted by Palestinians. It's not, in other words, it's not just a colonial settler state backed by the imperial powers, it's also a predatory colonial settler state that's continuing to expand. It therefore can't be part of any solution, any lasting permanent solution. The second problem is this, with this approach. It's muddling up two different things. The nature of the state, on the one hand, and the fact there's lots of people living in the area, some of whom are Jews, and some of whom are Muslims, and some of whom are Arabs with Arab Christians, and so on. The issue is not two states. The issue is, let us create some kind of entity in the region that respects the right of all people, regardless of faith, regardless of ethnicity, regardless of background, to live together in a community which is not based on systematic dispossession and discrimination directed against one section of the population. It is, I mean, Abdul has used this word, it's a system of apartheid. We have to get rid of the state that is based on apartheid and create a different kind of state where everybody can live together decently, a little bit like your Ottoman Empire, though I hope it'll be rather better than the Ottoman Empire.
Right. Well, I really absolutely agree with that comment. Absolutely. You see, I think people who talk about two states and partition, and I understand you, because that represents a commonly held view. That somehow, you know, let's see, there are these two groups of people, how can we do right by both of them? It's not right if we get rid of or throw out the invaders and their descendants, that is the Israelis, Jewish Israelis, and so on. So what's the best way, fairest way? Say, well, okay, we'll partition the country, and so on. Very quickly, a note on 1947, first of all, before I continue it. 1947, what I think you're referring to is the UN partition plan, which proposed to divide Palestine into roughly equal halves. One which it called an Arab state, the other which it called a Jewish state, and Jerusalem was supposed to be an international state, a city under international administration. That was the UN partition plan, 1947, which was never implemented. Okay, so let me just try and be as brief as I can. The reality is, if people talk about two states, as I say, with the best will in the world, it is to misunderstand the nature of Israel. It is to misunderstand what we have in the Middle East. We don't have an ordinary state. We have a settler apartheid state, which is aggressive, which is expansionist, exactly as Neil has said, that there is no room for a state like this in the Middle East, nor, frankly, anywhere else. So if we start from that premise, that such a state that practices this kind of policy, ideology, is not acceptable, we then start to ask the real question, which is, okay then, what are we going to do? And I hope we can talk about that later.
Right, we go back to the floor, so I don't know whose hand was first, but we start with this gentleman here, there's a lady there, and there's somebody else with a hand up. I'll take all three, and if I can fuse them, I will. If not, I'll take them separately.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Yes, you're going to speak up a bit.
Sorry. Basically, the point is, Palestine, a lot of people justify the fact that, well, you know, the Bible said that Jews should actually inherit the land of Palestine. But in reality, you have Palestinian Jews, Palestinian Christians, Palestinian pagan Arabs, and Palestinian Muslims, and therefore the land does belong to Jews. It belongs to Palestinian Jews as well as it belongs to every other Palestinian, in exactly the same way that you know, the Aboriginals belong to the land of Australia. So the question is, when they talk about the issue of the two-state solution, a Palestinian state is never quite viable. Now I'm thinking to myself, hold on a minute, could they not have given the Zionist European settlers, could they not have carved out a state for them in like Germany just after the Second World War? You know,
is that the question then?
Yeah, basically.
Okay, I'll take that.
Can they not have that as a viable solution for now? That's generally
the precursor to outsourcing. The question there, I'll come back to that, I'll just take the other comments, and if it's a relevant similar, I'll summarise them. Thank you.
I'm a PhD student. I'm working on settler colonialism and how language can be used as a tool of settler colonialism. So I'm using settler colonialism as an analytical model. In my study, I came across the question of indigeneity. So it's a really mind-boggling question.
So a question of what, sorry?
Being indigenous.
Indigenous, okay, yeah.
So basically, how long do you need to be born on a certain land in order to be indigenous? Or how long do you have to live on a land in order to be indigenous? Is this something to do with your DNA? Because if you think about it, no one in Palestine is ethnically pure. If you compare, for example, Palestinians to Aboriginal Australians or Native Americans, no one. So my question, how do you approach the question of indigeneity? What is the first step?
Okay, so you're positing the question on the basis that...
How do you define it? How do you...
And in the context of the questions of the Balfour Declaration, how do you... What's the...
Yeah, because the Zionist enterprise is a settler colonial project.
Okay.
And it means it's a clash between the indigenous people and the settlers.
Understood. Thank you for that. So that's the second, indigenization, and we have one of Europe or elsewhere, the third one, and then I'll come back to the panel.
My question is from Mr. Faulkner. So you said during your piece that in order for the Zionist organization to safeguard its interests, it had to stay loyal to the powers that be, to the imperial powers, which initially was Britain and now it's the USA. However, I tend to think that perhaps it could be the other way around. Perhaps it's not the imperial powers that are really people in power over here, and instead it's the Zionist organization, because they have control of the banks, of the media agencies, and all sorts of stuff. So that is one perspective. The other question that I had was in view of the beginning of these false flag attacks, starting with the King David Hotel attack, the USS Liberty attack, and then reading, after having read the paper by Oded Yinon saying a strategy for Israel in the 1980s, and with the view of expansion of Israel. You said that perhaps we have to look forward to creation of a state that is inclusive and not it's not something that is an apartheid state. However, with that expansionist ideology firmly, in a sort of, it's something that's firmly
Summarize the question.
Yes,
Sorry.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, just summarize the question. I'm sorry, it's just good.
Continue.
Okay. So what I wanted to ask you was, in view of all these things, and then later being confirmed by General Wesley Clark, where he said that 7 nations have to fall in the Middle Eastern area for creation of the Greater Israel. So how do you propose that we create a state that is inclusive when there is already an existing state that is basically being a bully in the region?
Okay. So the 3 questions. Let's take the first one. Why not Europe, or for that matter, I think Argentina was proposed, so was Uganda when this was being discussed. Why not those 2, or somewhere in, I don't know, Wales, sorry, many Welsh people here, or Bavaria, or Italy? Why not? I mean, if I can have a quick 1-minute response from each of you on that.
Okay. You see, I would say that it's muddling up 2 different things. It's muddling up Zionism, which is a political project to create a colonial settler state in the Middle East backed by imperialism, because it's in the interest of imperialism for that to happen. And the separate question of what do we do about anti-Semitism? What do we do about discrimination against Jewish people? That is not to do with creating a Jews-only state. That is actually, we fight anti-Semitism in exactly the same way as we fight Islamophobia, as part of a united movement. A united movement of the left, a united movement of the oppressed. We don't deal with racism by saying that the response to racism is to take somebody else's country. So I think it's the wrong way to put it. And it's worth saying that in the early part of the 20th century, the great majority of politically active Jews in Europe were not Zionists. The great majority of them were on the left, and they were part of broader mass movements that were trying to achieve social change in their own countries where they were living, including fighting anti-Semitism, including fighting racism. So I think it's the wrong way to put the question, really.
Yeah, of course, the issue of finding the Zionist state in Europe, I mean, it's interesting to tell you that before the founder of Zionism, Theodor Herzl, settled on Palestine, the Zionists had considered other places in the world, Uganda, Kenya, Argentina. So it wasn't an alien idea. They were looking for somewhere where they could plant their project. And then it became Palestine for reasons to do with the Zionists realized that in order to get Jews to leave countries where they were settled and comfortable, to go to Uganda, they was not going to do it. So if you talked about Palestine and the Bible and stressed all this stuff, you would get people ideologically fired and would do that. But I tell you something, it would be only just, in fact, if the Europeans, the West, the people who created the problem of anti-Semitism, discrimination against Jews, if they were the ones who actually were prepared to bear the cost of making it up to the Jews, not to outsource them and get rid of them onto us. But I really, without any joke, I tell you, that precisely is the basis on which the Western powers supported the creation of Israel, have supported it ever since. On one reading, it's because the last thing they need is Jews sitting, these sorts of Jews, sitting in their countries. They really simply don't want them. It's something that has to be faced. You don't want to
take the other two as well,
the other questions, yes. In terms of biblical justification, yes, of course there is. Biblical justification was used quite cynically by the Zionists, who are not religious, as you said quite rightly. They used it quite cynically because it had appealed to the Christian West, never mind the Jews. It was appealing to the Christian West, which has a lot of what today we would call Christian Zionists, but people who actually are influenced by the Bible, by Sunday school, by all the associations of the Holy Land with the Jews. So that really was quite a cynical exercise in using that angle to support the project. But in terms of Palestinian Jews, I could not have said anything more accurate. Indeed, in Palestine, as in other countries in the Arab world, we have Jewish people whom I would call Iraqi, Jewish Iraqis, Jewish Palestinians, of course. And we lived together, and there was none of this until the advent of Zionism. In terms of indigenous, how long, etc., well, I'm sure that if you live in a place long enough, I mean centuries, or for a long time, you would become part of the indigenous people. But the problem with Zionism, the problem with Israel being a colonial state, is because the people who came to the land were clearly people from outside the region. In no way, no shape or form could they be called the indigenous people. And they came and they took the land and expelled the indigenous people because they jolly well knew they were not the indigenous people. Now, if we were prepared to wait centuries with Israel, maybe, then it would qualify for being a native population. And so, in other words, what I'm saying is, no matter what the implication of your question is, in reality, in the end, it doesn't make any difference to the nature of the aggressive nature and the criminal nature, really, of the enterprise in Palestine. Zionism loyal to imperial powers, yeah, maybe I can leave that to Neil. Because the question of Rwanda, I think you want to get at the question of the pro-Israel lobbies. I'm sure that's what you're trying to get at. That's a big subject. And how do you get an inclusive state? Well, you have to. That is a really big subject, because what we're really talking about here is a state for the people, the people on the ground in Palestine, that is in historic Palestine. Currently, nearly half of these people are Jewish, and many of them from Western origin, and the other half is the indigenous population, are Palestinian Arabs, plus the Arabs who were dispossessed, the Palestinians who became refugees or exiles like myself. Now, these people are the people who should be living in one state, which should be a democratic state, so that they have equal rights, equal citizenship. And so that is the kind of arrangement I think that you have in mind. It's certainly the one that I have in mind. And you may well ask, not now, but I hope later, and another question, because I've talked for too long, how on earth are we going to get to that?
Okay, okay. Look, let me say this about the question about indigenality. Is that right? Have I got that right? Look, you see, the key thing for me is not where people are born. It's not where people have, where people's ancestors have their roots. The key question, and you see, if we try and define who's got a right to be in a particular place in those terms, then we create the basis for nationalism and racism. That is, we are then on the path towards fascist politics. The way I would put it is this: we need to make the distinction between the oppressor and the oppressed. So when we talk about Zionist settlers in Israel, we are talking about people who are contributing to a system which is based on oppression. It's based on an oppression of the if you like, the indigenous people, the people who were there originally, and we have to side with the oppressed, fighting back against that oppressor. And that's a completely different situation, it seems to me, from the one that we have, where we have people coming from other parts of the world who are coming into, and can I be controversial? And talk about Brexit. We have a completely different situation here, where we have large numbers of people who come from other parts of the world who are now being targeted by racists, who are now being targeted by the Home Office, who are now being targeted by right-wing politicians who are promoting Brexit, which essentially is code for nationalism and racism. And in relation to that, we have to stand with those people. We have to stand with the people who are on the receiving end of Brexit, racism and nationalism, even if they came in yesterday. I don't care. Everybody, my position on this is every single refugee, every single migrant is welcome here. And that's because these are the people who are on the receiving end of oppression. So that's the critical question. The critical question is, what side are you on in terms of whether or not you are a victim, you are oppressed, or are you part of some kind of apparatus of power and wealth that is subjugating other people? Do you want me to also deal with that other way? Look, this is what I would say about the Zionist lobby. You see, what you have to say is, you have to say this. I don't disagree that there is a powerful political lobby in the United States that is basically pro-Zionist. But I simply don't buy the argument that says that it's a kind of conspiracy, and this is why. How many nuclear missiles does the Zionist lobby have? None. None. The nuclear missiles are held by the United States, by US imperialism. The entire US is controlled by a huge, powerful, immensely wealthy military-industrial complex. It simply isn't credible to say that this vast mechanism of power and wealth can somehow be manipulated by a Zionist movement, because there happens to be quite a large number of pro-Zionist Jews in the United States. You have to say it is in the interests of US imperialism, it's in the interests of this military-industrial complex that Israel should be supported for all of the reasons that we've been talking about. So I don't deny the existence of the Zionist lobby, but I say the Zionist lobby's solicitations are welcome inside the US establishment because it conforms with US interests.
You mentioned Palmerston earlier on. That was his very view, wasn't it? Palmerston?
Yes.
No, in international relations there are no permanent friends or permanent enemies, only permanent interests. Right, one past.
So I would echo absolutely everything that Neil said about the lobby and who really is in power, whether it is the capitalist interest or the Zionist lobby. If there were ever to come a conflict between the interests of the two, the capitalist interests are far more powerful. And in fact, that was the case back in the days of the Balfour Declaration. Do you know, it's said that Palestine was offered to 4 different people at the time of the Balfour Declaration. So Balfour promised it to the Zionists. Sykes and Picot actually, with the line they drew, Palestine would have actually gone to the French. probably, but the French and the British always disputed that. But it should have gone to the French if they stuck to that line. The British secretly promised it to Sharif Hussein and the Arabs for revolting against the Ottomans and supporting them. And at the same time, the British were negotiating, thinking that the World War I wasn't going to go the way they wanted to, were secretly negotiating with the Ottomans in Switzerland and suggesting to offer it back to them. So this was a land promised 4 times over, probably. And if the Zionist lobby was all powerful, that kind of manipulation wouldn't have been going on. And it kind of links to what Gada says, in the sense that it's not like one man planning everything. It is about opportunities, and there were 4 potential opportunities, and it was about seeing which one bore out best. The issue of why not another place? Do you know, somebody suggested this recently. They said, what, you know, if Palestine was liberated, what would happen to those settler Jews that went there? And somebody said, well, Germany created the problem. Germany should deal with the solution. And that's a good quip, if you like, to say that. But you're talking about people, and it is a bit distasteful talking about taking this group of people and plonking them into a third person's land. The test, you know, the test is actually, would I mind if millions of Jewish refugees came to my neighbourhood in London? And frankly speaking, I wouldn't, because, and I continue to live in London, right, alongside those people. Because where they're living now is frankly unjust, those settlers, or those people that came in without a right. And were they to be offered a home in my neighbourhood, I'd have no issues with that. And that's not unjust. And it kind of links to this issue, how indigenous do you have to be? You know, being indigenous is not a good basis for citizenship. As Neil said, it is the kind of purist nationalist thinking. And it doesn't work. The Islamic principles I come from, right from the very start of Islam, you didn't have to be an Arab to be a citizen, right? There were Abyssinian African slaves, there were Romans, there were Persians, and there were Arabs. And the idea that you had to be indigenous is a bogus one. Many Jews live in Palestine because their fathers and forefathers, right back to ancient times, lived there. Many lived there legitimately because they were offered refuge by the Ottomans when Jews were expelled from Spain. And that's a legitimate, they're not indigenous from the sense of going back over centuries, but it's legitimate. So the citizenship should be legitimate, not indigenous. And, you know, it doesn't matter how long somebody's lived there for. If they live there because they had a right to live there, because they were invited by the legal authority to live there. Otherwise, my forefathers don't come from Britain, I was born in Britain. So when somebody looks at it from an indigenous sort of point of view, I'm nowhere. I don't have any legitimacy. When you look at it from a legal point of view, that the legitimate legal authority in Britain gave my parents a right to settle here, and because I'm born here, I have absolute legitimacy for living here. And that's how it has to, that's actually the way the Islamic system would work on this.
Okay, some more hands please from the audience. We have 1 at the back there, 2 at the back, and 2, so 1, 2, 2 hands, and then 1 here.
Thank you.
1, 2, 3, 4. So I can't speak up a little. Sorry.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this enlightenment. Today's discussion. I think I got some observation here about this so-called Balfour Declaration here. I mean, before I came to this meeting, see, I think I did do a bit of research. See, I knew about the Balfour Declaration, but I mean, I wanted to know. I mean, a little background, you see. Who is this Balfour? And the political circumstances led him to issue that. I think my research led me to understand that actually it is I mean, although the name is Balfour, you see, but the declaration itself, you see, wasn't, the author was Balfour itself. I think Balfour, did, request the Zionist leader, okay, one of the wise man, okay, to submit a draft, okay, which will be considered actually, you see, for national home for Palestinians, actually. These Zionist leaders, I think it was 1917 February, actually, they did do, and they did meet, okay, and then they submit this draft resolution, you see, which was approved by the Her Majesty's cabinet, and then Balfour actually, you see, used that name, you see.
Sorry to hurry you, but if you could just put the question.
So let me finish. It's very important because you can't just put a question.
You can be the next panelist if you wish.
Take time, please. Okay? So what happened there actually, you see, it is very, very clear. It's not been mentioned by any of the speakers here actually, you see. It was first of all Balfour Declaration. It's a Zionist declaration, you see. And this shows here actually, you see, I think it was mentioned here, how powerful the Zionist lobby. And another thing, actually, you see...
Can I ask you to just summarize, because the three other people waiting, I forget, but forgive me, I don't wish to be pushy, but...
Okay, let me finish the last point, actually, you see. The question of, legitimate, you see, on the basis of biblical, actually, you see, you did not mention, actually, under what international article, you see, does that, because we know that British has been consistent, actually, in Ireland in 1926, you see, when,
Can I just forgive me, but I'll have to move on because it is a speech rather than a question. The issue of Zionist influence has already been covered, so that's been addressed by the panel, and international law has already been addressed, so 2, 3, 4, I'll have to come back to it, forgive me. Is anybody else on this side? No. So there's number 2, and there's 5, so I'll take the next 4 and then I'll come to the panel.
A quick point about this whole debate, and I think the issue of the two-state solution, and recently Trump said, I removed Jerusalem from the table because it's always a stumbling block in negotiations. He recently said that. There's a wider question, I think, as a panel here and the audience. I think the discussion of a two-state solution or a one-state solution, or the issue of the Hamas issue or the PLO issue or Fatah issue, these are side issues really. We are not going to solve the issue of Palestine until we address the root issue. And I think a couple of the panelists already mentioned it, that this is a colonialist imperialist project.
Can I ask you to summarize it into a question? Forgive me.
This is a colonialist and imperialist project. Unless you have a roadmap that deals with the root issue of colonialism in the region, which is primarily sponsored by America, helped by the Europeans, this problem is not going to go away. So I would like to hear from the panelists, do you have a roadmap that will deal with the root issue, which is colonialism, which is spearheaded by the United States of America today?
Thank you. So if you can all reflect on that panel, and I'll take the other comments. One behind you, just pass the mic behind you.
Hi. The gentleman before me kind of touched what I wanted to say. But I'll say something. I'm from Uganda. The project of positioning the Zionists in Uganda has never died. It's happening. Do people know? Is the world aware that the Zionist project has never stopped and is not located in Palestine?
So you say the Zionist project is still alive in Uganda?
There's a coinage of a new area called the Great Lake Region.
Great.
Which has been coined by capitalists in conjunction with the Zionists.
Okay.
Bodies are dropping. Nobody talks about it.
Okay, so I'll ask a comment. 3, there's one here, this gentleman here, then that gentleman over there at the back. No, just this one with the check shirt, that's it.
Whilst I have every respect for your intellect and your knowledge, and there are a lot of intelligent questions coming from the audience, I thought I was coming to a debate. What we have here is a loving. You will agree with each other. Is that why I was offered my money back? I mean, where is the member of the panel here who has something to say that you wouldn't agree with? I mean, you would actually argue that.
Well, look, as a chairman, I can't answer that question. I'm putting whatever I would think the other side would say.
Well, there is no debate here, is there?
Well, I'll let you raise that with the organisers, forgive me. I hear your sentiment, but it's not a question I can put to the panel. Forgive me. There's a gentleman there, and then I'll come to the panel. That's a valid point. I'm not saying it's not a valid point. It's something you have to tell the organisers. Thank you.
Okay, so does it work now? Anyway, my voice is out now. So my question is, would you say that the Arab Spring revolutions were first a missed opportunity, and secondly, would you say that the revolutions arose because people were seeking for democracy and liberty, or rather because the economy was running bad?
Okay, that last question, I'll add to another question I have, so don't comment on that just yet. Deal with the other questions.
Can I just come on back to this?
Okay, the organisers will address you.
I probably have the best view of this. I did invite many pro-Zionist people, even the Lord Turnberg, other people that I tried to get, but they didn't accept my invitation. And we did say it's a debate, it's a panel discussion, if the leaflet you can see it. So I did invite other Israelis to come onto the panelists, but they didn't respond.
Well, there you go. That's the answer to the question. Thank you very much. So, deal with the question about the roadmap. Who wants to go first? John?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Indeed, you're absolutely right. That we must identify and keep in mind always what is actually at the bottom of this, what is the essential component of this problem that we have, which is indeed that we have a colonialist project which is supported by the greatest imperial power that we have today, the United States, and Europe follows behind. Yes, how, now, I'm not sure who is we, who's trying to fight this? Who is the we?
What would you say, Bella? Because I think the question is the panelists give a view as to what their roadmap would be.
No, I understand, but this is what I'm coming on to, which is that if you were to ask this of the Palestinians, as opposed to other people who are concerned in this issue, my answer would be that we cannot have a roadmap in the sense in which I think you understand it, or in which you mean it. I may be wrong, because it's very powerful. Because the odds against the Palestinian cause are extremely powerful, and people have to bear that in mind when the Palestinians fight for justice, for restitution of their rights, etc. They are not just fighting Israel. They are fighting a Western consensus, and which is now, I'm afraid, spread to some of the Arab states, a consensus that Israel has to stay and has to be supported. So we've got a really big problem here. So that's my first point, to recognize the size of the problem. This is gigantic. But if I were to give my own idea of how we might what we might do, I have for quite some time now been advocating that the Palestinians should abandon this idea of two states, should actually should request of their current leadership to convert itself from a quasi-state structure with prime ministers and presidents on, which is a farce, because it's not, to convert it into a leadership of an occupied people, which is what it is, and for those occupied people to demand equal rights. Now, if you think about what I'm saying, this idea, the question is very simple on the part of the Palestinians. If you address Israel, you say to Israel, you, Israel, are ruling this whole area, from the river to the sea. The whole of historic Palestine is being ruled by one entity, and that is Israel. But it is being ruled in an apartheid way, unjustly. Jewish Israelis, the Jewish part of the people you rule, have rights, and the non-Jewish part, those people have no rights. This we cannot accept. We demand equal rights. That is my idea. Now that becomes then the nucleus of the one state, because Israel then is put into a very interesting position where it has to answer to a very simple question. If you want to stay in our territory and you want to rule us, you must give us equal rights. If you don't want to do that, get out of our territory. And it seems to me that this is the real question that Palestinians should pose.
Okay. Thank you for that. My answer's rather different, because I'm going to approach the question from a slightly different direction. And what I want to say is this. First of all, history cannot be predicted, and it cannot be forced. And neither predicted nor forced in relation to major, intractable political and economic and social problems of the kind that we are discussing. In other words, I don't believe there is any simple, straightforward solution. I don't believe there's a roadmap that we can actually create, that we can then implement. I want to say, so that's the general framework, and then I want to make these two comments. One is to say that I think we were coming close to the possibility of a major reconfiguration of the whole of the Middle East in 2011 and 2012. And I want to say this about the defeat of the Egyptian revolution. The left in Egypt, and I speak as part of the left in Britain, the left in Egypt made an absolutely appalling mistake when they refused to back the democratically elected Islamist government when it was under attack by the Egyptian state. To think that the Islamist president of Egypt was the main enemy and that you should align yourself with the Egyptian state, with the Egyptian generals, was an unbelievably stupid thing to do on the part of the Egyptian left. And most of the Egyptian left was part of that mistake. They thought that Sisi would get rid of Morsi. And I think that completely derailed the Egyptian revolution, and that in turn derailed the Arab Spring revolutions as a whole. Had things panned out differently, had the Egyptian revolution been victorious and resulted in a democratic regime implementing a major program of social reform and driving back neoliberalism, driving back neoliberal capitalism, beginning to redistribute wealth in the interest of ordinary Egyptians and so on, we could actually be talking about a very, very different framework for the possible resolution of the Palestinian question in the context of a wider Arab revolution. That's one general observation I would make. Second observation is to say this about the United States. There are two United States. There is the United States of the military-industrial complex and the millionaires and the corporations and the banks. And there is the United States of workers and black people and women and so on. Those who have a history of fighting back in the United States. The history of the United States is a history of class struggle from below. The revolution, the Civil War, civil rights, and the struggle against the Vietnam War, which is relevant here because the Vietnam War was won, in a sense, on the streets of the United States. That's what broke the power of the military-industrial complex waging that war against the people of Vietnam. Now, what that does is it points to the kinds of forces that need to come into play, both in the Middle East and in the metropolitan heartlands of global capitalism, where the wealth and the guns and so on are flowing to sustain the Zionist entity. This is not something which we can predict. It's not something that we can force. It's not something about which we can say, this is when it's going to happen, because we are dealing with titanic political and historical forces at some point moving into action to make it possible for there to be a resolution.
Thank you, Gulwai.
Can I start with the Arab Spring? I think my observation with the Arab Spring is that it was a response to very oppressive circumstances for ordinary people. It was spontaneous. It was not something thought out and planned as a revolution. And as a result, it was curtailed before it did bring any real change. Now, there was a real change in the sense that people spoke out where they felt they couldn't speak out for decades. But before the deep state elements were actually removed or changed, the front men were simply removed and changed, and that was felt to be enough. In Tunisia, in Egypt, in Yemen as well. And in fact, I would differ slightly with Neil on this. The big mistake in Egypt was not, in my view, as late as when Morsi was not defended. The big mistake in Egypt was, with all due respect to the Muslim Brotherhood, and I don't welcome anything that's happened to them in the last few years from the Sisi government, but there was a time when the spirit of the revolution was to not just remove Mubarak, was to remove all those deep state elements which actually had maintained the regime for decades. And Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood actually did a deal with the regime, with the deep state, to have elections before that that had really removed those elements. And now, the reason this is important is links to what the gentleman in the back said. Those are the elements that maintain the colonial control on those regions. Those are the elements that have bought into the idea that Egypt, Syria, Tunisia, Palestine, the whole region cannot do without big American money or foreign money. And those people benefit hugely from it. They are fantastically wealthy. You know, those disclosures in Panama Papers and these kind of things, big bank accounts for many of those people. But even those that might have some sincerity, they genuinely believe that the region can't thrive without external help. And I don't know if I have a roadmap, right? I don't know if I have a roadmap to ending the colonialism in the Middle East, but I think there has to be a change in the mindset of the people that actually, you know, if anything like the Arab Spring comes again, there are some things that need to be at the forefront. And one of them has to be that if we do not break this dependency, like the drug addict has on heroin, which is harming our society immensely, then actually there's no future. You're literally going to replace one set of faces for another who are going to implement the same kind of policies over you. And this is one reason why I have no confidence in this idea of a two-state solution, or what Trump says or what Obama says, because all proposals for Palestine are built upon the premise that they will serve United States interests, not that they will serve the people. I don't believe that Palestine is strong enough for those people, those leaders there to break out on their own. But in the region, there has to be a change of this mindset, that we have to sever these links and really go on our own. And it's not impossible. It's a region which is brimming over with resources. You take the fuel in the Gulf with the fertile lands of somewhere like Egypt, and you have a region that is self-sufficient, really. It should be calling the shots, not being dictated to. And that is something that needs to be in the mindset of the people if you're looking for a solution. What were the other ones? I've lost count of the questions.
I'll ask one final because we're running out of time.
I think the gentleman is right, by the way. A lot of my colleagues may know better than I, but I'm pretty sure that it's well known that Balfour himself didn't pen that.
Oh, no,
I mean, this was penned in the Foreign Office, and people say Sir Mark Sykes wrote it. But
yes, no, I'm sorry that I didn't respond to that. I meant to.
I think we should give opportunity, even if there is something you see, say, but we should give opportunity fairly, because you come from far away.
Give the guy
maybe
he comment on the Balfour.
Yeah, let me just quickly, let me just say to the gentleman, you're quite right. You are quite right. The Balfour Declaration, to start with, was never written by Lord Balfour. That is for sure. Secondly, it was certainly written by Zionists. Certainly. And it went through many drafts. And furthermore, not just Zionists in Britain, Zionists in the United States So the draft of the Balfour Declaration was being written and rewritten in this country, across to America, from America back to here. It is the most extraordinary story. By the time it was finalized, of course, Balfour had nothing to do with it. It was a Zionist document. You're quite right.
Thank you very much.
Okay, we are now coming close to the end of the evening, so I can't really take any more questions or comments. Forgive me. You had your opportunities earlier. Those of you who were shy, it will be next time. With regard to the Arab Spring, I want to ask everybody for a quick 30-second summary on it, because I have a comment of my own or a question. The Arab Spring was seen as a hope for unification, for legitimate governments or governments to arise from the people. Given that it's failed, given that the Arab states have miserably, by the leadership, failed to assist the Palestinians, isn't it time that people accepted the status quo? So I want 30 seconds from everyone, and then I will summarize the proceedings and close them.
Well, you started with hope, and then you said, isn't it time we accept the status quo? I don't know how you can go from one to the other.
It's balanced.
I have hope. I have hope. The Arab Spring was unforeseen, and I think we will see many other unforeseen things. That region has seen occupation and tyranny in the past. The Crusaders were there for 100 years, and that region was liberated to a better time. So I'm very positive.
You're optimistic. 30 seconds.
Okay, well, pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will is an expression that was used by an Italian revolutionary back in the interwar period, and I think it's good advice for anybody who's concerned to try and change the world. We have to be realistic about the power of the forces opposed to us, but we have to say, we, the people, all of us, regardless of race, regardless of faith, regardless of our ethnic background, all of us united together, if we all moved together, we could create a new world based on democracy, equality, sustainability and peace, and that's what we have to fight for.
Right, well, yes, I have to be honest, in the short term, I am not at all optimistic. I think things will get worse. And one of the issues that I think my colleagues were talking about, this is the earlier question, about doing something on a regional basis is fine. The problem is time. We don't have time. Israel is moving at a very rapid pace to take over the rest of Palestine. Israel has increased its power all the time. We don't have time. So in the short term, I am pessimistic. I see nothing but increased strife, conflict, fragmentation, division, and so on. In the long term, I have to be optimistic because I have to believe that the forces of good, the people understand injustice. They fight against it. They fight against oppression in whichever way they can. Although all those willing fighters will, in the end, triumph. And as Neil says, if we could all join together in that great effort, I am very optimistic in the long term.
Thank you.
Thank you very much to all the panelists who turned up. As we were corrected by the organizer, the Israeli supporters or people who support the State of Israel were invited, but chose not to attend. I've sought to put the questions they would potentially have commented upon in the justification for the State of Israel. Ultimately, this is a discussion about a political problem that will require a political solution for the benefit of all people, not just Arabs, not just Europeans, not just Palestinians, not just Jews. Ultimately, when we sit here and take the benefit of the learning from the panel that you have assembled before you, and of course you, the audience, it's about learning from the mistakes of history, learning from the delusion and deception of things like the Arab Spring, and having an optimistic, certainly an optimistic outlook
as to what tomorrow will bring. With that, I thank all of you for coming to the event today, and of course I thank my panel, and until the next debate, thank you very much.